Hello and welcome to the Science Room podcast. Today we're going to be discussing one of the darker sides of science and answering the question, are the conclusions obtained through unethical methods tainted? As an introduction, we're going to look at the example of a scientist called Joseph Mengele, a Nazi doctor who performed horrible experiments on live Jewish prisoners during the Second World War. I'm going to steer clear of the details of the experiments, as many of our listeners will probably find them pretty disturbing. But what fascinated Dr. Mengele was the similarities and differences between children who were twins. In particular, what would happen if you combined the bodies of two twins together? But why bring this up? It's an extreme example, but it raises questions of how we use scientific knowledge that was discovered in unethical ways. Consider a disease that affects children who are twin brothers or sisters. Should we look at Dr. Mengele's findings in order to find a cure for such a disease? What if the disease is life-threatening? Are we somehow saying we think Dr. Mengele's work was okay by using his data? And moving away from Dr. Mengele himself, for the scientists listening, would you read or cite a paper written in a country where you knew animals were mistreated in research? Would you read it but not cite it? One thing I am sure of, though, is that science is a human activity, done by humans. It's about curiosity, fun, and solving real human problems. Scientists are humans with hopes, dreams, fears, and biases, and yet somehow, world-changing discoveries are made. Hopefully that's enough questions to get you thinking. So for now we're going to have a short panel discussion, and I'm here with Alana, Christian, Dave, and John.
Hello.
Hi. John, can I start with you?
Well, the good news is we don't actually have to use their research because it was bad research. As in,
Right.
It wasn't just unethical research, it was low quality research.
Right.
Because much like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany heavily politicized science. So it wasn't good scientists, it was loyal scientists. So it's actually kind of a non-debate over the Nazi stuff, because it's not a good enough quality. Even the best quality research they produced, and the one that's been cited the most, which was experiments not done by Mengele, but I think at Sachsenhausen, about freezing people. It's been widely recognised that it's completely useless, and also they destroyed a lot of the records, so it's not like this is a big ethical question.
I mean, my feelings in terms of the original question of whether it taints the research, whether it was ethical or not, is I don't know if it matters. If there was any knowledge gained from it, then that is useful. It's not like anyone wants to repeat those experiments. So if we have learnt anything, and I'm going to assume that John knows what he's talking about when he says that it wasn't well done science. If we can learn anything from that research, then, well, that's a good thing to know more.
So in this country we pride ourselves on, or at least when you watch videos online, from the research councils, we pride ourselves on doing ethical research, which is also systematic. So maybe the two are kind of related in a way, especially when you're talking about an experiment involving humans or involving animals. If the humans or animals are distressed or are not consenting to the research, then that's going to influence your data in some way. Christian, what do you think?
Well, I'm not a scientist, but I do think if you're using a living being against its will in order to test it in some way that is stressful or painful or ultimately results in its death, that's always going to be unethical. That's not to say that it's not going to be useful in terms of the data.
And I think for the legitimacy of an experiment, especially when you have that sort of stress, even with any sort of mammal, you have stress hormones and they affect your body, and it could color the data. That is true. To have them in a stressful environment, the results could change.
Well, this cuts to the core of the question, I think, because it was recognised in the 60s and formed the basis of why we changed our laws around animal research, that there isn't a conflict between ethics and science, and in that one has to be concerned with animal welfare to do good animal welfare experiments. One of the great problems with research coming out of America, even though they're well funded, is they have no laws governing animal research, whereas in Europe we fairly recently have the British system rolled out over the whole continent, it means that every animal experiment is being reviewed by many different bodies. It means that they've got someone who's got the power to say to a scientist, you're not allowed to do that, you have to do it this way, because you're very right. there's a lot of experiments that have been done and a lot of data that is useless, and it isn't like ethically tainted, it's just useless data because it was done improperly, and you're actually measuring a stress response and not a response to the treatment that you're using or the stimulus you were looking for.
What I'm going to ask you about now is, so you guys have lived in America for quite a while. How important is the public's attitude to the ethics that's taking place, and how much do the public understand what research happens, and how important is it that they do understand?
I would say, at least in America, science literacy is, in the general public, is very low, very low. I think that most of the time people don't really know what's happening in terms of research. And when they do, there's very isolated sort of public outcry. But there's not really a very good understanding of what's important and what's not, and how the animals are actually treated.
And also culturally, in America, there's, for example, here, if you were, using makeup that had been tested on animals, or if you wore fur or something like that, there would be more, people might shun you or something. It's not really considered acceptable, whereas in America, I think people don't really have that attitude yet.
I mean, yeah, I think that the people's idea of the people who are saying, "Oh, don't wear fur," the people who are throwing paint at you on the street, and things like that. In America, they have the idea that it's a very radical idea to not want to do that. That you're some sort of radical.
It occurred to me, part of the main question here is unethical research tainted?
Yeah.
And I think that if you've got someone who's doing illegal research, or research which is contrary to the mores of the time, which includes stuff which is in the legal in that country but unacceptable in the scientific community, it's tainted because science is based a little bit on trust and the belief that the person telling you something hasn't just made it up, because we do have problems with people making stuff up. And if they are somebody who is going against the general flow of science or even breaking the law, you can't trust them. You can't trust that person to have done the right thing in that instance. So why can you trust them to do the right thing in their actual experiment and not doctor their results? We have reached an excellent area of the welfare and the experiment working towards the same ends. And that's been exported across Europe. And I really hope it does get exported to other countries.
Well, we haven't reached an end point though. It's still, we look at research 50 years ago and say how terrible that was. Is it not possible that in 50 years they'll look at what we're saying is really good now and say that that's unacceptable?
And we do use research from the past.
No, I'm just saying we look at that and say how terrible, how cruel. Is it not possible that our so-called really good standards that we have today will be looked upon as terrible in 50 years' time?
Potentially, but you raise a really interesting point there, that the past is a foreign country. Using research from 50 years ago is almost like using research from a country with no ethical standards that is doing bad experiments. And we cite this stuff all the time. Like I've been citing stuff from the 1860s.
I don't think we should not use it. Any research from the past. I'm just saying we probably shouldn't pat ourselves on the back so much, because it's probably not quite as good as we think it is, because we only have the past to compare ourselves to.
In terms of going off of that, in terms of reduction, I'm not exactly at all informed on the matter, but do you think in the future it would be possible? It is very hard now to grow certain cells in culture, but the fact that we're making new organs basically out of stem cells, do you think that in the future certain experiments could be run on organs or tissue systems that we make?
Yeah, it's improving all the time. It just depends on the tissue you're trying to study. So in my lab, we study vision and various diseases that cause blindness, and that is something which is not so easy to do in an animal model in general, because most of the animals that we have use are mice, but doing any kind of eye surgery or putting implants and things into a mouse eye is obviously incredibly fiddly because they're so small. So we do a fair amount of work with tissue culture systems. So we have cells growing on a dish in a way that's supposed to mimic the layers that they would form in reality. And a lot of people have managed to get this sort of the spontaneous formation of like a sort of a primitive eye structure with stem cells in a plate. So it is possible to. It just depends on the type of tissue you're wanting to do, and there's obviously limits to that, but
Yeah, whereas I would say, I mean, I agree with everything Dave said in general, but I would say that no, there's never going to be a point where tissue culture is ever going to completely replace animal experiments. Because the point at which we know enough about the tissue to do the experiments on these cultures is the point where we don't need to do the experiments because we already know everything. You know, we're never going to be able to predict everything, but it's all about reduction. It's not complete replacement, it's about reduction. And there's a really fortunate thing about how we set up our laws is that there's this idea that you have to test every drug on a certain number of animals in order to be able to test it on humans. This is not actually true in the law. In the law, all it says is that you have to demonstrate that it's going to be safe. And we are legally set up to tomorrow replace like phase 0 animal clinical trials before we go on to phase 1 with non-animal replacements. We can legally do that. We just have to accept as a scientific culture what is the standard we need to set and what's the test you have to do.
So you're saying if you're a pharmaceutical company and you wanted to get a drug that you've designed on the market, you would be able to legally, without changing any laws, be able to demonstrate that it's safe without using any animals at all.
If you could devise the tests and if we could agree on the tests as a scientific community, then the law's already there, which is great.
Okay.
It's just a matter of doing it.
Yeah, I think that's always going to be tricky because you definitely want to. If you're testing a drug, say, you want to see what it's like in a whole system. Because a drug that you're testing on whatever disease it is isn't only going to come in contact with the cells that you're interested in. So you probably always are going to need some kind of animal, I would assume.
Okay. I think one conclusion we definitely came to is that the public are incredibly important in making these decisions. The public need to know what research goes on, and the public have to have a say in which experiments we perform and in future which data we use. If we manage to do this, hopefully in future we'll have a situation where that trust is there, where the public really can trust scientists and scientists can trust one another. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Please ask any more questions that you can on the website.